This is the first video going over the Chapter 3 lecture slides on supply and demand. Very honestly, as I start recording this, I'm not sure if there are actually going to be 2 or 3 videos. There might be 2 videos going over part 1, where I analyze or where we talk about demand by itself, right? What consumers will do and what impacts what consumers will do. And supply by itself, what impacts what sellers will do, what producers will do. And I'm going to use those terms throughout, seller and producer, synonymously, right? So assume that they're basically talking about the same group, right? The ones that are creating and selling the product or selling the product to the consumers. Right? So all of that is part 1, right? Looking at each of those concepts independently, because it's really important to recognize demand is all about consumers and what they're going to do, regardless of what the sellers, the producers will do. And supply is all about what the sellers, producers will do, regardless of what consumers will do. It's only in part 2 where we're going to bring supply and demand together that creates a market, and then we'll actually find out what they do together. Right? So here we're analyzing it separately, and you got to get used to thinking of it separately. Don't jump to putting it together until you understand what consumers' incentives are versus what producers' incentives are. Okay. Now a little more background. So I've mentioned the word market. So a market is basically just for any product, right? Any product category, whether it be smartphones or cars or breakfast cereal, all of the buyers and sellers of that particular good, right, in that market, how they interact together, right, and basically prices, as we'll see, is going to be the main determinant of basically how they relate to each other, right? Because prices is basically what the consumer has to pay and what the seller gets. And then we'll see that creates, as prices change, each of those parties' incentives change. We're assuming this Chapter 3 analysis assumes a competitive market. Right? Basically, what does that mean? It means that it's not a market where there's only 1 or 2 buyers and 1 or 2 sellers, right? This simple model, and it's going to be a very simple, right, graph, basically, XY, right, coordinate, basically 2 variable graph with price and quantity, just like we had a 2 variable graph with the production possibilities frontier, with 2 different goods in the last chapter. So simple graph. It's going to basically describe a lot of the dynamics of what happens in a market, assuming it is a competitive market, right, where there's a lot of sellers, right, at least more than a few, a lot of buyers. And further, it works kind of the extreme, right, which we'll define later in the course, actually more explicitly talk about the idea of perfect competition, kind of the I don't know, the holy grail, the caricature of being as competitive of a market as possible, right? Where each company produces exactly the same thing, right? So consumers are going to go with whoever's cheaper. No buyer or seller is big enough to influence the market price, whereas that's in many markets that's not true, right? So Apple has a lot of influence over the price of smartphones, for example, right? So the more that it is true that the products are very similar, where consumers don't have preferences, where the sellers and buyers, there's very many of them, so neither of those parties impacts the price independently. The more accurate this simple model is, the more of the dynamics of the market that this model explains. The less that's true, right? The less companies, for example, the more it gets nuanced, and the more, although it doesn't make the supply and demand analysis meaningless, but it explains less of the market dynamics, where you might have to bring into more game theory and stuff if there's only, for example, a few companies. Right? So here we're assuming there's a lot of companies, a lot of consumers. And as I took all the time to explain a lot of companies, a lot of consumers, here I'm going to use an example where there's one company, and that company happens to be, well, the Yankees in Major League Baseball. Right? So, but here I'm basically just trying to demonstrate the idea of demand, right? Which is what the consumer is going to do, right? As the price changes. So the fact that we're only looking at one company per se, because I'm looking at a hypothetical Game 6 of the World Series, Yankees in the World Series. Let's assume for a moment this is a normal year where fans can actually go to watch the game. And what we're going to look at is so how are consumers going to respond as the price of these tickets is either higher or lower. What I would typically do in a semester where we're meeting in class is do this on the board, right? Literally, I would go and say, hey, what if the price is this? How many people want to go? And how many tickets you want? All right, what if the price is this? What if the price is that? And that would always create, right, something like this, which is called a demand schedule, which basically says, hey, if the price is $50, let's hypothetically say that people want to buy, right? So maybe 10 people want to buy tickets, and together they want to buy 24 tickets. But if the price is $100, hopefully everybody's intuition would say that if at $50 people wanted to buy 24 tickets, if the price is 100, well, some people don't want to go anymore. So let's say the quantity of tickets that would be demanded in the class would be 20, and so on at 150, 200, 250, 300. And I've kept this linear so that when we put it on the graph, it's simple, but it clearly doesn't have to be linear, right? Or a linear relationship between as the price goes up by $50 each time the quantity goes down by 4. That doesn't have to be that be that simple, right? Okay, so here's the demand schedule. Well, most of the time, although we'll sometimes be looking at demand schedules in this class, and you'll have homework problems and perhaps test questions that'll have a demand schedule. But typically we're going to relate it to what? A demand curve, where we're basically just going to plot this information on a two-dimensional axis, right? Y-axis, the vertical axis being the price, right, that the consumer has to pay to buy the ticket, and the horizontal axis being quantity of tickets, where further to the right on the graph is higher quantity, higher up on the graph is higher price. So we have two dimensions on the graph, and we have two dimensions in this table, in this demand schedule. So we can plot these points, right? Because each price quantity combination creates a point on this graph. So let's take the top point. So $50. Well, how many people want to go? 24. So basically that point represents that price quantity combination. So $50, 24 people want to go. And let's pick the bottom point. So if it's $300, well, now only 4 people want to go, and hopefully it's logical, right? That if the price is higher, less people want to buy the product, less people can afford it. There's a higher opportunity cost. You know what you would have done with $50? I can't do nearly as much with that as you could with $300. So 4 people want to go, and that's represented by that point. And we could plot each of the other 4 points, and they would go somewhere in between. And then typically what you'll see the line connected, and often you won't even see the points. You'll just see the line, and it'll be called demand, and often just labeled with a D for demand. Okay? So that's what a demand curve is. And the one thing that's always going to be true, it doesn't always have to be a straight line, although for simplification of demonstrating these ideas, often it will be, right? Often we'll just have it as a straight line, but it doesn't have to be at all. The one thing that will always be true is that it'll be downward sloping. And why is that? Well, that's because of the hopefully logical conclusion or intuition that, hey, as price goes higher, the quantity that people want to and can afford to buy decreases. And when that is true on these axes, where price is on the vertical axis, quantities on horizontal, that results in a downward sloping demand curve. So demand. This is This is an example of demand for a hypothetical class where I basically asked people, hey, at each price, how many people want to go? Well, let's assume this was the response. But more generally, what is demand? Well, again, remembering this is consumers' choices, what the consumer would do as price changes. So literally, a verbal definition of demand: the quantity that possible buyers, right? I made the possible buyers our class, right? So that's the potential buyers for this product. So the quantity of possible buyers in the market want to buy at all possible prices, right? Which, one of these prices, let's assume, and typically I would say, oh, this is in, the right field, upper deck, whatever, so it's a certain section, so people have a better idea of whether they'd be willing to pay this or not, because obviously it would be different at different places in the stadium. But bottom line is, as price changes, the quantity that people want to buy changes. But in reality, maybe that just one of these prices exists. So maybe the Yankees are, for example, charging $250. And if that's the case, then our class, or this hypothetical class that this table is based on, 8 people would want to go, or 8 tickets. They would want to buy 8 tickets. So the actual price, whatever price exists in the market at any moment in time, is part of demand. But something that students sometimes have a challenge kind of internalizing is this idea of demand, this definition, this concept of demand doesn't just include the actual price. It also includes all of these other what if prices. It also includes, okay, so what if the Yankees charged more? What if they charged $300? Or what if they charged $200? What if they charged $50? All of that is part of demand, and it's really important to internalize that that's what demand means. Demand does not just mean how many people want to buy something at the price that exists at the moment in time you're thinking about it or analyzing it in the marketplace. Demand is, hey, what if the price is higher? What if the price is lower? And estimating what would happen to the quantity demanded, the amount that people would want to buy at a particular price, right? So although this sounds, really specific, it needs to be able to use these concepts or these terms and use this model to analyze things effectively. So demand includes all possible prices, not just the price that exists. Quantity demanded, well, that is more specifically, how much people want to buy at a specific price, which includes the actual price, and that's often the one that we'll focus on, the price that exists at a moment in time in the market. But every possible price has a associated quantity demanded, right? So I said that the Yankees are charging $250, so the quantity demanded at a price of $250 is eight tickets. But price of $100, even though it's not the actual price in this hypothetical example, well, that also has a quantity demand of 20. Okay. So demand, the whole thing, quantity demanded at a specific price. Here's the example that the textbook uses to demonstrate the same idea, right? And this is demand for natural gas, right? And per BTU, per British thermal unit. You need to know what that represents in this class, right? But price per BTU, and how many trillion BTUs would people want to buy at each price? Now, I'm not going to go there. Okay, so at each price. So basically, this curve, as you see, this time it's not represented by a straight line the way my Yankee example was, but it is downward sloping, right? Which, because it's always going to be assumed to be true, because you have to come up with a pretty strange scenario where it's not true for an entire market, it's going to be called a law, the law of demand. And it can be stated in many ways, any way that demonstrates or describes the fact that, hey, higher prices, people want to buy less. Lower prices, people want to buy more. The law of demand creates a downward sloping demand curve when we plot these points. But that's basically, we're going to assume that that is always true. And just as a quick refresher, what on this graph represents demand? What on this graph represents quantity demanded? Well, the whole table, right? Demand schedule, typically called. The whole table of price quantity combinations, that's a representation of demand in this market. And the whole curve, the demand curve, is the same information, but represented in graphical form. So either the whole curve or the whole table represents demand. Quantity demanded, however, each specific point on the curve, each line on the table has a specific price quantity demanded combination, right? So for example, the point I'm pointing at, the point I'm pointing at, at 375 per BTU, the quantity demanded, and it's harder to see exactly what that number is on the graph as it is in the table, but looks like it's somewhere north of between 7 and 8 trillion BTUs, right? You can see that from the graph. But from the table, you can see it more specifically, so 7.5. So each point gives you a price quantity demanded combination. Each line on the table gives you a price quantity demanded combination. Okay. Now, where does this demand curve and demand schedule come from? Well, I mentioned in the Yankee example, normally I would ask the class, all right, how many people want to go if the price is 50? And I would literally count up how many people raise their hands. And if I were doing it accurately, I would also say, all right, at $50, who wants to go and how many tickets do you want? And I would add up all of those tickets. And at each price, that would create the quantity demanded at that price for that market. Well, so that's conceptually how the demand is created. Each individual, right? Each individual in the markets, a demand has its own demand curve. Like I would have a demand curve with the Yankee example, right? Let me actually go back for a second. So if the price was $50, I don't know, I'd probably get 6 tickets and bring some friends. If the price is $300, I would probably get 1 ticket and wave to my wife as I go to the train station because I would go by myself. Now that might sound cruel, but my wife would be so pissed off if I bought her a ticket for $300 with our money to go to a game that she doesn't value as highly as I would. Right? But that kind of demonstrates how, so at $50, maybe I'd want 6 tickets. At $150, maybe I'd want 4 tickets, right? At $200, maybe I'd want 2 tickets. And at $300, maybe I want 1. So that creates my individual demand curve, just like this example, right? For the BTUs, the Gonzalez family, right? As the price goes down per BTU for natural gas, they're going to use more. Right, so they'll probably cook more, or if maybe they have their heating is natural gas, so then they'll keep the thermostat higher. But if the price is higher, they'll conserve, et cetera, et cetera. Right, so they have their own demand curve. The Murray family has a demand curve. Every other family that's part of this market, right? If this is the United States, millions of families would be part of this market, and all of those hypothetically added together creates the market demand. Right now, obviously, we don't know exactly what the Gonzalez family and the Murray family and any kind of situation like that. It's impossible to count all that stuff up, right? Because the data just doesn't exist. But that's hypothetical. That is theoretically what this market demand curve represents. It's all everybody's individual demand added together. Okay. Now, so far I've talked about demand, and I've talked about it in terms of how does the quantity demanded change as the price changes? And that's all that's in the model, right? So the only variable that impacts the quantity that people want to buy And go back to the Yankee example again. That people want to buy for these tickets on this graph is the price of the tickets and how that changes. But is that the only thing that the consumer would care about, right? So, me, for example, as I make this recording right now, yeah, by the Yankees' chances of actually making the World Series aren't looking nearly as good as it was in the beginning of the season, as I record this in September. This shortened, weird season. And if most of my favorite players and and most of the big guys are not in the lineup, right? They're injured. That would impact how much I'm willing to pay. This was hypothetically how much I'd be willing to pay at a hypothetical game. But if all of a sudden I haven't bought the tickets yet, and the day the game comes, and I have a chance to buy tickets, but it's 40 degrees and rainy, and there's probably going to be they'll probably get the game in, but there'll be like a 3-hour game will take like 6 hours because of a bunch of rain delays. I'm staying home and watching it on TV because my desire to go would decrease, and people's desire to buy something, right, and ability to buy something changes for things other than just the price of the ticket, right? So because price is the only variable that consumers care about that's shown on the graph, by definition, everything else the consumer cares about is held constant as we adjust price to create that demand schedule, to create that demand curve. However, when something that's not on the graph that the consumer cares about, like the weather for the Yankee game, well, then demand changes. And as we'll see, a change in demand is going to cause the demand curve to shift, right? So an increase in demand causes the demand curve to shift to the right, i.e. the quantity that people want to buy and are able to buy at each price is higher. As demand, if something causes demand to decrease, demand shifts to the left. Right? Here's a more tangible example than this generalized thing, but basically noticing here that so here's two different time frames that the author is graphing, or first the table and then graphing of the demand schedule. So price per BTU, what quantity do people want to buy in 2002? And then the same information in 2006. So presumably some things have changed between 2002 and 2006 that caused, as we can see, the quantity that people want to buy when you add up all the individual demand curves in the market, the quantity has increased, right? So for example, at $3.50 per BTU, whereas in 2002, collectively people wanted to buy at that price 8.1 trillion BTUs of natural gas. But in 2006, that same information, 9.7. Now, so again, increase to the right. And why is an increase to the right? Because we're basically saying that, hey, if we hold price constant now, right? Remember, demand is created by adjusting price and holding everything else constant. But understanding a demand change when something other than price that the consumer cares about changes, well, effectively, each point we're holding price constant and saying, well, which direction, which does quantity demanded increase, shift to the right, like this example, or decrease, shift to the left. Now, what might have caused this? Well, people's income might have gone up, right? In fact, there was an economic expansion happening in this period of time, so people's income going up. Between 2002 2006, a lot of houses were being built, right? So more people were owning their own homes before the whole thing collapsed in 2007, 2008, 2009. So that would increase the demand for natural gas. Population growing, right? All of those things could be contributing to this, increase in demand. And this basically, if we went to this link, with the Bureau of Labor Statistics would show that the economy has improved. So logically, people have more money, keep the thermostat a little higher, increase demand. Okay. So that's what demand is, all possible prices, and how as the price adjusts, how does that change the quantity that people want to buy? And if something other than price changes, demand curve shifts. So what are the different types of things that make demand shift for individual markets? Well, on the following slides after this, I'm going to have a bunch of specific things that will change demand in predictable ways. I'm actually starting, however, with the catch-all. Right? If if none of the other things that I'm about to go over on the slides in the future change that impact how much people want to buy, right? It impacts people's preferences. Well, then economists basically just lump all those other types of things together and say, all right, consumers' tastes, consumers' preferences have changed. And what types of things change that? Seasonal changes, right? Fashion changes. Increasing environmental consciousness will increase demand for renewables, right? Renewable energy. Decrease demand for things like electricity produced from coal, right? Fossil fuels, for example. So, for example, what happens to demand for boots in October, right? Well, it increases. What do I got here, actually? Destination tournament doing better than it. I don't even remember why I have that point, so don't worry about that. So basically, all kinds of things change consumers' preferences. Okay, so that's going to be lumped into consumers' tastes. However, other things change demand in very predictable ways. So here's actually something that has been happening over the last decade or so and is predicted to continue to happen in Japan and frankly most developed countries. What happens to demand for diapers in Japan as the birth rate drops? Well, less babies, logic would say, that decreases demand because the potential, the population of potential buyers has decreased, right? Instead of 50 million families needing diapers, well, maybe next year it's 49 million. Maybe a decade from now it's 40 million. Right? Population in Japan is shrinking, and in most developed countries, that is the projections, right? So if the population potential buyers decrease, that decreases demand. Throughout most of history, population has grown in most countries, so that has increased demand. All right. If the price of the newest Xbox console, by the way, these specific things that change demand, these slides I'm going to be for my macro classes and my microeconomic classes. If you're taking micro, you need to know these because you'll be tested on these. If you're taking macro, it's more just the concepts. You're not going to be tested on the specifics because these are really micro issues of what is changing demand for individual markets, right? We're going to use the idea of supply and demand in macro to look at the economy as a whole. That's going to be a little bit of a different thing. So you're not going to be tested on these specific things in macro. A little aside. All right, so back to this. So you might want to fast forward if you're just taking macro, or listen, but don't worry about remembering it. Okay, if prices of newest Xbox consoles are expected to drop the week before Christmas, what happens to demand in November? Well, if collectively people are expecting prices to go down in the future, likely demand is going to decrease before that expected future drop because people are going to wait for prices to drop. And a lot of people do this. People wait till like right before, a holiday, waiting to get the sale for things that kind of just go kind of clearance items, right? So if they expect it to go down, they wait if they can, right? So expectation that future prices are going to go down causes demand to decrease now, waiting for that price decrease. which may or may not come. Okay, people's incomes collectively change, right? So let's say people on average are getting richer, right? People's incomes are going up. How is that going to impact demand in individual markets? Well, for most things, as people's incomes go up, their demand increases, right? For most goods, that would be true, right? So if my income doubles, for example, I'll go to restaurants more. I'll buy more fun things. I'll worry less about how much I'm spending on gas. I'll not worry about too much about what temperature my thermostat is, trying to save money or anything. So for most things, demand increases when income increases. Okay. Well, because that's true for most things, when that is true, when income and demand move in the same direction, for example, if income increases and demand increases, well, that's going to be called a normal good. And by the way, that's the definition of normal good. And again, if you're taking micro, you need to know that. Right? You need to know that a normal good is defined as income and demand move in the same direction. Income goes up. That means collectively, as a market, people demand more. Right now, right? People's incomes have gone down. So for most goods, right, for normal goods during this COVID-19 recession, demand is decreased. Right? So that's for normal goods. However, not all goods are normal goods, right? For some goods, if income goes up, demand goes down, or if income goes down, demand goes up. Well, because that's not the norm, we're going to call those inferior goods. That's one of the reasons they're called inferior goods. Another reason they're called inferior goods is because most inferior goods have a superior alternative that people, if they had enough money, would rather buy. For example, generic products, generic brands. Most people don't buy those because they think for example, generic cornflakes, because most people don't buy them because they think they taste better. They buy them because they're cheaper. And if they all of a sudden won the lottery, well, they probably buy the name brand. Often the case, right? The classic example that is in almost every economics textbook that most college students can relate to, that I can certainly relate to when I was in college, ramen noodles. I can picture myself in my freshman dorm room with my little water heating thing and heating water to have my 25-cent at the time thing of ramen noodles I could eat for $5 for a month, right? But I don't eat ramen noodles very often anymore. Even though sometimes they're kind of tasty, but they're barely food. Nutritional value kind of sucks. Why? Because I make enough money so I don't have to save that much money on food. So I've picked superior nutritious alternatives to buying ramen noodles. Fast food is often an inferior good, right? So the thing that makes these inferior by definition is that income and demand move in opposite directions. If people's income goes up, they want less of these things. If incomes go down, like now, they want more of these things. And I would not be shocked if we went and found out what's happened to the demand for ramen noodles during the COVID-19 recession. That demand has likely increased. So you need microeconomics, right? You need to know those definitions. All right. Sometimes if the price of one good in one market changes, that impacts the demand for goods in other markets. For example, what happens to demand for travel? Well, right now there is no demand for travel, but in normal times, what happens to demand for travel to Hawaii if airline fares to the Caribbean, right, the islands in the Atlantic, where people also go to a lot for vacation, increase tremendously? Well, if the Caribbean becomes really, really expensive, well, shit, let's just go to Hawaii. So there's these, and why is that the case? Why is the fares, right, how much it costs to get to the Caribbean impact the demand for a different market? Well, because they're substitutes. Because normally when people are looking to go on vacation, right, they're going to pick one of these two things. And if one of them goes up in price, like in this example, Caribbean fares, well, if people consider the people who consider Hawaii as a substitute place to travel, would go to Hawaii instead. So because people are choosing between them. So if two things are substitutes, and sometimes they're substitutes for a few people, but the more that is true for the bigger part of the market, if price of one of those things increases, the demand for the other one increases, right? So if beef prices go up, demand for chicken likely increases. And the examples are endless. However, second example, an increase in the price of hot dogs will do what to the demand for hot dog buns? Well, if hot dogs are getting more expensive, people don't want as many hot dogs. I don't know anybody for the life of me who would want to buy hot dog buns unless they're putting a hot dog or a sausage in them, right? Because they're basically just a carrier of that thing, barely food. Well, those two things are complements, right? So unlike the substitutes where you're buying one or the other, hot dogs and hot dog buns, or gas and automobile, or printer, ink, and printers, those are complements. You buy them together. For complements, if the price of one of the two goods you buy together increases, the demand for the other one likely decreases. Okay. So, question, right? So kind of thinking back on these, which of the following will likely cause an increase in the demand for SUVs, sports utility vehicles, big ass vehicles? Well, if gasoline prices drop by 50%, when OPEC, which is Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, by the way, increase production, right? So prices go down. Now, sometimes when I ask this question, sometimes people might say, okay, the demand for SUVs will increase if the price of steel decreases, because there's an end to trade tariffs. That, however, is not going to impact demand. Why not? Because as a consumer, I don't give a shit what the price of steel is when I'm buying an SUV. I only care about that if the sellers of SUVs raise the price that they're charging for my SUV, potential buy SUV, because the cost of steel for them has gone up. I'm not buying the steel, I'm buying the SUV. If the producers eat the price increase of steel because they don't think they could sell the SUVs if they raise the price more, I don't give a shit. It just means they make less profit. It won't change how much I buy the SUV or not. So that's an example, that quick little description is an example of why it's critical to keep the concepts of demand and supply separate. Demand only changes when one of these things that the consumer cares about, that impacts the consumer's ability for income or desire or the size of the market, where it impacts the consumer. That's the only time demand changes. If something that the producer cares more about, that the seller cares more about, like price of the inputs to production, well, that's not a change in demand. As we'll see, that's a change in supply. So keep the items concept separate. Otherwise, you're going to come up with some really bad answers to potential questions. If you try to if you forget to keep these concepts separate, think of demand first, consumers, as we'll start talking here shortly about supply, producers. Only when we bring them together does the decisions of the producer impact what happens in the market. I'm going to keep going. So I said in the beginning, I didn't know if I was going to make one video for this part 1 or 2. But let's do supply as well, because supply will go faster than demand just did, because you already have the basic concepts. And this is basically just the mirror image, right? Everything's going to be very similar, right? The analysis of creating demand for supply, and the definitions are going to be the same, except now we're going to replace consumer with seller slash producer. So what is supply? Supply is the quantity that possible sellers in the market want to sell at all various possible prices. Again, just like demand, it's not just the price that actually exists in the market, but what if the price is higher? What if the price is lower? That changes their incentives. It changes the quantity supplied in the market. Just like quantity demanded, quantity supplied is how much that collectively do the companies, right? How much are they willing to produce slash sell at a particular price? So same thing, right? So here's back to the textbook example that the author goes through, where we have a supply schedule and graphing those price quantity combinations creates a supply curve. Just like we had a law of demand, we have a law of supply. What does the law of supply say? The law of supply is basically the opposite of the law of demand, whereas the price rises, the quantity of the supplied increases. Now, what's the intuition behind that? Why does that make logical sense? Why does that make logical sense? Well, consumers like lower prices, right? So they want to buy more. Producers, sellers like higher prices, because what? Because they make more profit, right? When they sell a product, let's assume that the price goes up, but it has not changed their cost to produce it. Well, then each time they sell a BTU of natural gas, that increases their profits, right? It makes it more, for natural gas, for example, it makes more sense to supply more to the market, to basically do some more hydrofracking, right? To increase the quantity that you're supplying to market because it's more profitable at the higher prices. So again, reminding ourselves of the distinction between the supply. We looked at the distinction between demand and quantity demanded. Same concept with supply and quantity supplied. So supply is represented by the whole supply schedule, the whole supply curve, quantity supplied. Each specific price has a specific quantity supplied that you can see either on the graph, looking at where that point, right? So 375, for example, 375 per BTU. We go to that point, go down, and see that somewhere above 11 trillion BTUs are sold, and we can see the number more specifically on the schedule, where at $3.75, 11.5 trillion BTUs are supplied. I said sold a second ago. Sold is only going to happen in part 2 when we bring supply and demand together. So again, this is what producers would want to do. It's important to understand that, right? Sometimes some producers are part of supply even if they're not producing anything, right? I have no interest in hot dogs outside Yankee Stadium sell for like $2 a hot dog, right? Being able to sell a hot dog outside Yankee Stadium for $2 a hot dog, I have no interest in being part of supply. No interest in selling hot dogs outside Yankee Stadium. But if the price, and that's always what supply is and what demand is, right? What if prices, right? Actual price and all what if prices. Well, at the price of $2, if that's the actual price, I don't want to be part of supply. But if I could sell hot dogs for $50 outside Yankee Stadium and people bought them, I would love to sell hot dogs outside Yankee Stadium. That would become my summer job when I'm not teaching, right? So that's important, really important to internalize that idea. Supply is not necessarily how much the companies sell. It's only true at the price that exists at the moment. But it also tells us an estimate of, well, what's the quantity that the companies in the market or the potential companies in the market would want to sell at different prices. All right. So just like I went over the example of hey, an individual or a market demand is basically the sum of all of the individual consumers who are part of that market and how much they want to buy at each price. Same with supply. And in this case, it's sometimes actually possible to create an accurate supply curve because maybe there's 20 companies and you can estimate how much each of them are going to provide as price changes based upon, well, for natural gas, where they're drilling and how much, have some idea of what the costs of production are there. So bottom line is, for any market, hypothetically, what the market supply curve is adding up the individual companies and how much they would want to, again, reminding you, want to sell at each price. That's obviously impacted by profit. Now, just like with demand, sometimes something other than the selling price, what they could sell the product for, that producers, that sellers care about, changes. When it does, supply changes. And on the graph, we see that as a supply shift. A supply increase, just like for a demand increase, is a shift to the right. A supply decrease is a shift to the left. Sometimes when I'm going over demands, a student says, so demand increases when demand shifts up. I'm actually going to jump back in the slides. Right? So demand increases when demand shifts up, as opposed to thinking of it as to the right being an increase. Well, if you think of up as an increase, and you kind of translate that or carry that forward into analyzing supply, you're going to get it ass backwards, right? Because this looks kind of like up, going from the S2 supply curve to the S1, right? It's nothing about up, right? It's at each selling price, what's happening to the amount that the companies in the industry want to sell. If that is increasing at each price for some reason, I think we'll go over the reasons here, some of the main reasons here in a second, well, supply is going to shift to the right. If that is decreasing, supply is going to shift to the left, right? So again, left and right. And here's an example. So here they tell us why in this table, as opposed to the consumer example. The authors highlight what is the main reason that supply increased between, this was actually, again, 2002 versus 2006, because new technology, and pretty much the hydrofracking that I just mentioned a second ago. Right? So before that new technology, we had a certain amount of supply at each price, at each possible selling price. But now, more of the natural gas that's in the ground is profitable to get out of the ground at each price, and possible to get out of the ground because of new technology. So supply is shifted to the right. And again, this is where I'll highlight that for the most in this chapter, right? For macro, you're not going to be tested on this. Good to listen to it, but micro, you need to know these specific types of things that change supply and how they change supply. So production technology changes. So that's an example of this, right? New machines or new procedures, hydrofracking, that make it more possible or more efficient, cheaper to produce a product. Well, that's going to increase supply, because if it's cheaper to produce, right, the costs of production are lower. So at each price, the profit is higher. So and that's going to create more of an incentive to produce it. So supply increases. Now, again, remember, supply increasing just means that at each possible selling price, companies want to make more. We don't yet know exactly how much more might be bought and sold in a market where supply has shifted to the right, where supply has increased. We're only going to know that in part 2 when we bring supply, what the producer and seller will do, together with demand, what the consumer will do. Okay. So right now we're just saying, hey, they would want to sell more. Right? This is basically for pretty much any technology product. The march of supply is to the right, whether that be solar panels, right? The cost of producing them going down all the time. So at each possible selling price for the solar panel going to the right. So again, there's what I was just saying a second ago, more profitable at each selling price, right? As it gets cheaper to produce. Right? Like that. So that improvement in production technology is one reason, right? That is usually highlighted in our text, and homework problems and test questions could be kind of separated out as a specific thing. But bottom line is, production technology improvements are typically making it cheaper to produce a product, or, I guess in the hydrofracking example, more possible to produce it. But there are all kinds of other things that could change how much it costs to produce a product. So those things collectively get lumped into what's called changes in cost of inputs to production. So when the cost of the producer, whether it be labor or materials or advertising or distribution or any of those things change, that's going to change their incentive such that at each selling price, if their costs increase, it's less profitable at each selling price for them to produce that product. So supply is going to decrease. If it gets more expensive, if it gets less expensive, right? If the costs go down, that's going to increase supply, right? Like it did for pretty much always for production technology. You're never going to see a question asked where production technology gets worse and supply decreases. Production technology always is going to be increasing supply. Whereas other inputs, other reasons why the costs of production change, right? The cost of inputs, just as easily, just as many examples of costs of production increasing and decreasing supply as there are examples of costs of production increasing supply. And another main reason that supply could change, just like with consumers, when the size of the number of consumers either increases or decreases, that will either increase or decrease demand. The same thing with sellers, right? So if a new company comes into a market, all other things being equal, that's going to increase the supply. At each price, there's going to be more products available for sale. For example, in the airline industry, back in the 90s when I was working there at American, anytime Southwest Airlines, right, they were the first low cost carrier, and anytime they would come into a market and add flights, well, that would increase the supply. It would increase the number of seats that were available, number of flights available each day, each week. So supply would shift to the right. Now, we're not yet analyzing what would happen in that market because that's part two. It's important to have the distinction of thinking as the consumer for demand and then thinking of as the producer for supply. And it's only when we bring them together do we have a market. And by the way, for those of you taking macro, that's part two, understanding the distinctions of, that demand is from consumers, supply is from producers, is important at a general level. But most of what we're going to be doing there is kind of bringing supply and demand together. And that's part two. Okay. Yeah, I don't have to go to that. Okay, I kept it slightly under an hour. It's a little longer than I like to make a video. But that is part one. And then part two, we're going to bring the two concepts together.